Good evening, everybody. Thought I might just start off with a quote. We were surprised. There we were, little old us, the country that made such a horlicks of the Millennium Dome celebrations in 2000, putting on a flawless performance, the most logistically difficult thing you can ask a country to do in peacetime. Some of us were frankly flabbergasted, gobsmacked. I want you to hold that thought and remember that feeling of surprise, because that surprise is revealing of our chronic tendency in this country to underestimate what we can do. We need now to learn the lessons of the Olympics and the Paralympics, the moment where I think we collectively rediscovered that we are a can-do country, a creative, confident, can-do country. So I won't offer any prizes for guessing who that's a quote from, but that is Boris Johnson at today's Conservative Party conference, revelling in what he described as the ready brek glow of happiness as a result of the giant hormonal valve opened in the minds of the people. So it's that sort of feeling that led the Institute for Government to think that it would actually be quite interesting to understand why, after what one of our interviewees described as the flurry of failure and fiasco at the turn of the century, why we both went for the Olympic Games and actually seemed to manage to pull them off rather successfully. So we in the Institute for Government are running a series called Making the Games, and this is the very first in that series. And we're absolutely delighted to have with us today two of the critical games makers, she says in inverted commas, realising that that's probably a brand name and LOCOG is probably about to sue me. But that's an in-joke for people who've been involved in the Olympics. But anyway, so I'm Jo Rutter, I'm Programme Director here, and I'm sort of overseeing our project on learning lessons from the Olympics and Paralympics, which we're doing in collaboration with the Government Olympic Executive and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And I'm actually delighted to be joined here today by two of those key people. On my immediate right is Jeremy Beeton. Jeremy was Director General in the Government Olympic Executive. He joined in July 2007, which the clever or informed among of you will realise was 2 years after we'd won the bid. So 2 years down, 5 years to go. He's stayed there ever since. This is Jeremy's first and probably won't mind me saying probably last job ever in government. But Jeremy ran the Government Olympic Executive, and Jeremy's going to give us his perspectives on actually what was the scale of this project management task and how did he make that happen. One of the things that's come out of some of the interviews we've done for our Making the Games project is the absolutely critical role of finance. Some of you will remember that the Olympics was originally won on a slightly false prospectus that it could all be done for 2 and a bit billion. The budget was then upped quite significantly to, I see some people already dissenting, but was upped quite significantly, and as part of that deal, another finance director was brought in. David Goldstone came in sort of as part of a package with the money and joined in. Only part of it was needed to finance his salary. David joined in September 2007 and has been the Director of Finance and Build in the Government Olympic Executive ever since then. Both Jeremy and David are in their dying days in the Government Olympic Executive, which itself is winding up, which, as Jeremy would tell you, is actually what happens in projects. You know, you get recruited to do a project happens, and then you go, which is also something quite counterintuitive for those of us working in government. But anyway, so what's going to happen now is Jeremy and David are going to share their thoughts, reflections, insights with us. We're going to talk for about 10 minutes each. Then we're going to have a biff-batter round from what I think looks like quite an informed audience, but if you aren't part of the wider Olympic family, do feel free to ask some of the blindingly obvious questions that those who've been steeped in this since 2002 might not have thought of. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Beeton to kick us off. Jeremy.
Okay, well, thanks for that. So I wonder where I'll start, and I thought I'd start not with the Olympics at all, but with the Major Projects Authority that is sort of been set up in the Cabinet Office. And why? Well, you know, if you think about government as a client, it should be the most informed, most intelligent project client in the country. It is far and away the biggest. And for David Pitchford, who kind of runs the MPA, you know, if you talk to him, he's got a list of, last time I looked at it, it was about 206 projects and about £400 billion worth of work. And you sort of think, so what does government want out of all of that? Well, it wants work to be done on time. It wants quality right. It wants safety to be excellent, safety standards, and within budget. And if you can't do that, you get characters like the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary standing up saying what they want and what their policy is, and sort of there's nobody following behind on implementation and actually making it work. And so now MPA's set up a training agreement with Said Business School in Oxford. And you know, one of the long-term objectives is to have within government a whole pool of people who are competent program and project managers and who can deal with some of these big complex things that government has to deliver. Sort of the basics of plan and understand, to direct and to lead. And hopefully that will turn reputation round. So we don't have things like the Scottish Parliament that was 10 times over budget, or the Edinburgh tram system, or carriers that start at 3 billion and end at 10 billion, etc., etc. We just sort of can't afford it. And so kind of what we've managed to achieve, all of us, on the Olympic Games, is to get the thing done on time. Well, you kind of got no choice about that with an Olympics, and get it done within the budget and get it done safely. And sort of that was really briefly what I was going to talk about. I came here from an American project management business, and I often say to people, yeah, actually Olympic Games, it may feel big at the time, but on the world radar screen of major projects, sorry, it's just not there. It's too small. And so in money terms, at sort of £9 billion and change, you know, I could tell you two housing projects in the Middle East that are bigger than that. But in complexity terms, it's right off the radar screen. It is unbelievably complicated. And that's probably a characteristic of many things in government, and a particular skill set that's got to be learned. It's a very different sort of project. Most projects that I've worked on in my life, you build something and you can go back and have a look at it afterwards. But this was leading a team of people through 5 years while I was here, but 2 years before that, 7 years in total, through to a period of 6 weeks in the summer of 2012, where we had to do everything on time and we had to get it right first time. You know, you cannot ask Usain Bolt to go back and rerun the 100 meters, if you don't mind, because I forgot to turn on that camera at the back of the room. You know, sorry, you've got to get all of that right, and you've got to do it well. And you have the eyes of the world upon you. We had, you know, in excess of 120 heads of state here, both arriving and departing, all through that summer. You know, and you think of the preparations that the country has to go through for a G20 meeting for 3 days. You know, we had the G120 for 6 weeks, sort of a different scale. And therein is another one of the stumbling blocks of an Olympic Games. Its scale overwhelms in almost all of the aspects of the Games. And all of the team quickly had to get to grips with the scale and the implications for their business. You know, bringing 10 million in and out to watch a series of sporting events. And you know, if Paul Dighton was here, he'd sort of say to you 26 World Championships simultaneously for the Olympics and 20 for the Paralympics. You know, and it's bad enough just doing one at a time. The structure of Olympic Games is also rather peculiar. Would that I had a slide. I've got one slide I've kept with me for 5 years, which tries to map out the structure of Olympic Games. And the conclusion that you come to when you look at this slide is actually nobody's in charge, which sort of is true. You know, the correct answer to who's in charge of the Olympic Games is nobody. And therein lies another peculiarity of the Olympics, that it's not a joint venture, it's not integrated, it's not a consortium. Tessa Jowell put it to me quite well not long after I was here. She said that, Jeremy, it's a coalition of the willing, right? Which is sort of true. And we were all of us led by the brand of this Olympics because the country was behind it and it was a national project. And the eyes of the world were going to be on us for our 6 weeks of the summer. Another peculiarity of an Olympic Games is that it sort of starts with 2 people in a room. And I sort of liken this to Tessa and probably Tony Blair or something like that. And you can imagine a conversation over a gin and a cheese sandwich went something like, come on, Tony, what do you think about bidding for the Olympics? And that ended up with them bidding for the Olympics. And those 2 people became an organisation of in excess of 200,000 for 6 weeks. And it collapses back down to nothing. I mean, the OCOG at the moment is down to about 400. We're down to 20 or 30 within ODA and subsidiary organisations. So you'd be lucky now to get to 1,000 people. So you're building a FTSE 100 company and you're working it for 6 weeks and then you're getting rid of it. It's a very, very interesting sort of a project. And within there, and David's probably going to touch on this a little bit more than I will, there are a series of joint venture agreements as between the major stakeholders. So think the City of London and the British Olympic Association and the government who set up this entity called an OCOG, and that was the vehicle for staging the games. And government remains as a shareholder for the OCOG, and quite bizarrely, the financial guarantor for the OCOG, because the city can't stand behind it because it's not big enough, and the BOA certainly can't stand behind it. And there are some absolutely marvellous letters that I've got. I'm going to keep them for the rest of my life.
It's probably not allowed, Jeremy.
Sorry?
It's probably not allowed.
Oh, no. They're absolutely top secret and restricted, but this is, I'm just going to tell you anyway. So this is like sort of Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer saying, "Dear IOC, we'll pay whatever it takes. Love, Gordon." And the Secretary of State saying, "We'll keep it safe and secure. Love, Secretary of State." And the Prime Minister, Blair, saying, "Well, the country will do whatever it takes. Love, Tony." Right? And there's this bizarre situation of government having to be both shareholder for an OCOG, for the likes of the legacy company, and 100% shareholder for ODA, and give them their cash, and yet sort of an imbalance of control, yet an absolute guarantee. And what that does to government for us, and actually for all of the delivery partners, is it means that we've all got to be well informed, but we've got to be intelligent, right? We've got to act as clients in totality for these games, even though actually we're not really the client. But the reality is if we don't do the work well and represent our country well and enable the delivery partners to operate to the very best of their ability, then the thing fails. And if it fails for one of us, it fails for all of us. And that is so often true on any big project that you may be looking after. So within, on our side of the fence, we spend a lot of our time identifying and solving issues, trying to look at gaps in planning. There were many oh my God moments, and again, probably David will touch on these. Some of these came from Tony Foote's department here in Treasury. He was the guy to blame. A lot of it revolved around money on village deals and media centre deals. And the reality is, as a group, within our budget, we just had to push this project through the whole lot. And I'll let David elaborate a bit more than that. We had continuous examinations. This is not like going to university, where you sit your finals, right? We used to have an endless procession of people coming through our doors from Treasury, PACs, NAO, parliamentary questions, Freedom of Information Act, OGC, where's Pitchford? He's not here tonight. The NAO, they're here. And it just went on and on and on. Oh, there you are, yeah. Now, the fact that is not joined up to me from the world I came from is completely bonkers. Right? And it is so debilitating to teams of people trying to deliver something on time, on budget, etc., and having to put endless explanations out there about why we chose this particular company and not this one, or why we are going to sign off on that change order. It is not necessary. I've done enough work in my life where my client just gave me the cash and told me to get on with it. Here's the money, here's the scope of work, you're responsible, that's the date, deliver. And again, a characteristic, it seems to me, in government that is different from major projects is sort of governance money, operational delivery, all that sort of responsibility never actually resides in the one place. I thought it was quite exciting at one point to have 7 different accounting officers for the Olympic Games. God knows what they all did, right? But anyway, we had 7. So all of that complexity of government control, right, within that, you've got to get the work done, you know. And so I see Nicky Hughes sitting at the back from LOCOG, right? You know, there's an organisation that they had sort of 7 years to prepare, 6 weeks to do it and get out of it. You know, they had to be absolutely certain that the ODA were building on time. You know, we had to be absolutely certain that the other delivery cities, such as Cardiff or Weymouth, etc., were doing what they had to do on time. And this continuous need between all of us to deliver, to sort of, in my words, seek forgiveness, not permission, just get on with it. You know, the accounts will land where they are. We've got to get it done, because on a time is of the essence project, it is exactly that. It is time is of the essence. And it was going to be, you know, 27th of July at 8 o'clock in the evening that it started. Despite that, all of that complexity, I would say, we did manage to keep listening and paying attention to who was the customer for these games, which is slightly different from who was the client, in the sense of we recognised that the customer was actually the athletes. And Colin Moynihan was particularly good in the Olympic board, and many others, you know, in the organisation, at keeping those of us who are more interested in steel and concrete focused on the fact that it was actually a sport project. And many times we used to have to pinch ourselves and say, oh, we've got to talk about sport for a minute, because that's what the project was about. And continuously engaging as a group with the IOC and the IPC, the needs of the athletes. Because again, an Olympics, to give you an analogy, is a bit like a 4-leg relay race. You know, the first leg is you've got to get the stuff built. But then you've got to hand that over on time to the OCOG, who's got to get all the staging for the event ready. All the manpower, all the services ready. And the third leg of the relay race is you give the baton to the athletes, and they've got to run fast and jump high, and it is upon them that the success of the games actually lies. You know, how many medals we won is a very important thing to UK. And they did well. But there's a last leg, and we give the baton back to the leadership and the politicians. And so now what are you going to do? What does Olympic legacy look like? So, you know, with Seb Coe in the Cabinet Office and Dighton in Treasury and others in leadership roles going forward within the legacy company, etc. You know, what is the legacy of the Olympic Games, and how is that going to be delivered? And that's going to be, I think, Jill, another sort of discussion that you're going to have here. We've managed risk. David will talk a little bit about that. We try to make sure incentives are aligned for the right sort of performance. We got the right sort of behaviours from people. And so we all got ourselves to January 2012. And we started talking about readiness and, you know, what are we going to be like on the 25th of July when we got everybody in place. And we brought a great guy in from the Air Force who took us through a sort of a whole process, which I've written down and called discuss, crawl, walk, run, refine, ready, perform. And just through a whole series of test events and training, we all got ourselves into a position where we were ready for the torch relay. That was a great success. And, you know, kicked off with Danny Boyle's performance on the 27th of July. So I'd like to finish with just one thing I haven't talked about so far, which is safety. Usually, you know, when I'm talking about project work, I start talking about safety. Safety is very, very important to a project manager. A good performance on safety for your projects defines your project. It defines a way of working. And on the Olympics, we've completely rewritten safety performance in this country. We've managed to execute one of the biggest projects the country's ever undertaken at a safety level it's equivalent to people working in an office. our accident record is less than 10% of the national average. You know, we didn't kill anybody. You know, you go back to the days of Athens, and in the last 3 months, they were killing somebody every week. And that stuff actually matters. And a lot of it comes from the way you work, and it defines your reputation. And on safety, we've got a great reputation. And that's something that, you know, as a lesson learned, needs to get embedded throughout the construction industry. And I know HSE are trying to do exactly that. So I've probably talked more than 10 minutes. I'll shut up now, Jill. And
Okay, Jeremy, thank you
pass
very
over
much.
to David.
Well, as everyone knows, the government's track record on, even when it sets increased budgets and coming in on budget, is not necessarily brilliant. I think David, when we last spoke to him, was planning on handing back a few $100 million. I'm not sure whether he's still planning on handing it back, but found somewhere else to squirrel it away to. But anyway, we thought it would be great for Jeremy to be joined today on the stage by the person who was responsible for managing the money on the project, David.
Thank you, Jill. So yeah, as Jill said, we are going to be in the happy position. Well, effectively, Treasury have already got it, but we will, in overall budget terms, have returned. It'll be at least 300 million. So that's the sort of outturn position. And for me, the context is when as Jill said, I joined, Jeremy and I joined middle of 2007. The 9.3 Olympic budget had been recently set, but at that time the perception was, you know, it is something that will get blown. It was something that, you know, all the reporting at the time was that the history of major projects in the UK was it would be late, the budget would get bust, and it was only by a sort of how much would it all go wrong sort of question. What I thought I'd do is sort of, I've got sort of half a dozen sort of significant features, I think, of how, from a government funding and a public funding point of view, the Olympics is being managed that may be, you know, useful or relevant for other projects that I can sort of draw out. So I'm just going to go through those and hopefully do that in about 10 minutes. The first one I think is one people often say in these sorts of contexts, looking back on what things went well, but I think it is always worth restating. And I think having the right people, the best people you can get in the key roles is, to me, decisive. I think, and I know it's not necessarily sort of flavour of the month to say it in government at the moment, but we did spend money and invest in getting the best people in the most critical roles in the ODA at sort of chief exec and director level, you know, market rates for top people. We, I think unusually for a government sort of client team, as Jeremy described, also invested in expertise. We brought in from outside specialists in sort of construction programme management, in transport, in sort of, you know, commercial contracting, in sort of systems and assurance, who could help with a relatively small team but with specific expertise be an effective assurance and challenge and support to the ODA through the construction. So investing in the people I think was key, and it enabled us to build a relationship of equals because we were able to have sort of a conversation about why we're doing that, what, you know, issues in business cases, issues about funding, that was on a sort of level basis with expertise that had been brought in from the wider market. And I think that was very important, and I think you know, the investment has very well paid for itself. So the best people in the building and investing in time in relationships can't be avoided. A simple point about budgets, Jill mentioned how, you know, how many major projects haven't delivered to their budget. I think the important thing about the budget set in 2007 was that time had been spent in getting it right, and it was sort of comprehensive. That may sound very basic, but there are a lot of projects, there have always been a lot of projects, and there still are, that don't do that. So things like inflation properly allowed for, taxes properly allowed for, the cost of delivering the project management resources necessary to deliver effectively, properly allowed for. Those sorts of things, and building up a really comprehensive budget, I think was very important. And I think from the Treasury, as having been one of the most worried about overruns at the start, getting a comprehensive budget in place that was really deliverable, I think was an important stage in sort of building confidence. So the right people in place and a realistic budget gave us, I think, a good starting point in 2007. One of the things I think that we have done that I think is probably novel but is very replicable in other circumstances is the way risk and contingency have been managed. Jeremy mentioned the focus there's been on assessing risk, identifying risks and challenge. From a financial point of view, we aligned the management of the contingency money with where risks were best managed. So we actually put the money where the risk would most appropriately be managed. So to sort of expand that a bit more, we ended up effectively with 3 levels of risk and 3 levels of contingency. There's individual projects, so the cost of materials on the stadium or on ground clearance, that's a project-specific risk, and there was project-specific contingency against that. On a project like this, time limited on a constrained site, there are program-wide risks. So acceleration if there'd been delay, the interface between different projects, the interface between ODA and local or other stakeholders. Those were sort of program-wide risks, and we had program-wide contingency for those. And there were some risks that are outside the control of either the project or the program, but still may affect it. So changes in legislation, external factors such as the economy, could all have major effects. And so we had a 3rd tier of contingency that was for those sort of beyond our control risks. And we managed that contingency at those respective levels at 3 different levels of control. So the ODA did have control sort of with our oversight, but predominantly in the ODA's control for project-specific risks and contingency. We in GOE controlled the program-wide risks, but involved all the other funders and other stakeholders, but we actually sort of owned it and could make decisions on it. And we had a ministers group that we had to go to where it was sort of beyond the control of the program. So we had decision-making aligned to where risk was best managed, and we could allocate contingency quickly and appropriately to where the risk was arising. And I think that is the IUK report from the Infrastructure UK team in Treasury report on sort of British construction a couple of years ago has highlighted that as something that's a good model others could follow. Incentivisation, again, something Jeremy mentioned. We built incentivisation also into the way the funding and contracts were managed. So again, at a number of different levels. So for example, ODA's contracts with their suppliers were all focused on rewards for success, so effectively enhanced payments and performance rewards for delivering early and delivering under budget, so sharing success, not sort of penalties for failure. The ODA's delivery partner, CLM, their contract has had a lot of press attention because it has produced high profit. We've been sort of unapologetic about that because they delivered a very large, complex project on time and under budget, and it's sensible and appropriate to incentivise them to share in that success. And we actually structured the funding of the ODA to create an inbuilt incentive as well. So to the extent the ODA was able to generate its own savings, up to a level we said, well, you keep those and manage them, and incentivise the teams and project managers to free up savings, to identify them, because they knew they could recycle them and cover their own risks and costs internally without having to come to government for approval. And that created a sort of a beneficial culture and behaviour of not sitting on savings and keeping them in a budget, as project managers often do, but flushing them out and freeing them up so they could be redeployed. So I think trying to build in incentives for the behaviours you want and actually financially rewarding that, I think, has been very important. 2 other, I think, major points I'd want to make. One is about decision making, and the second is about sort of reporting and transparency. Jeremy said, the key emphasis, obviously, on this time-limited project was about making decisions on time, not delaying the work, keeping the work going. But we did have the 7 accounting officers, is absolutely true. At one point, we had 7 different accounting officers with different financial responsibilities. And what we had to do to sort of reconcile those 2 things is get a structure where we could make decisions quickly, but collectively. And that was, a challenge, but something we effectively did through having one forum where all the funders and all the other stakeholders came together to deal with every issue we ever had about business cases, about releasing contingency, issues on ODA scope or budget, all dealt with one forum, which we called the Olympic Project Review Group, OPRG. And that was meeting very regularly right through the sort of period when the bulk of the work was being done. So quite often sort of twice a week through 2008, 2009, and dealing with issues with all the officials, all the stakeholders represented. People had to go away and get the sort of formal approval, so we had to go back to ministers, the GLA staff went back to but actually we all knew where we were going to land, and we'd all agreed in one forum at one time what the decision was, and it was timely and it was collective. And I think that sort of forum has been invaluable. But what we always did was make sure we were keeping the work going. So there was always, a ODA, keep going whilst we're making the decision, don't let the funding get in the way. And we had a forum where those decisions got made. And on reporting and transparency, I think this is the other thing where I think maybe we have done something more unusual, but maybe worth thinking about for other projects, is we have been very open about the financial position right through the life of the project. So, as Jill said, the overall budget outturn, it will be somewhere over 300 million under budget. We've been trailing that for, in quarterly reports, we publish, as the name suggests, every quarter. The start of that was that we published the baseline budget and scope in 2007 once the total 9.3 budget had been published. So we got out there what's going to be delivered and what's the breakdown of the budget, and then we started doing regular reports to sort of update on progress on that with a full budget update. And we did sort of briefings for opposition politicians and then a full media briefing, and we've been doing those every quarter for the last about 4 years. To me, the great value has been, I think there's been a lot of beneficial effects of that, not all of which were obvious at the time. We stopped what was a ridiculous tide of sort of parliamentary questions, FOIs, because we started answering them just saying it's in the last quarterly report or it'll be in the next one, and people eventually stopped asking. Or not asking so often. But I think more importantly, we sort of educated and got rid of a lot of the myths that were around in journalists who were reporting every issue that came up as, oh, it's going to bust the budget. And they started understanding how it was managed, what the contingencies were in place, how that was managed. And we spent a lot of time sort of educating so that there was an understanding of actually why we were confident we would manage and deliver this on time and under budget. And the other benefit, though, that I think is worth mentioning is it did put pressure on project managers and owners of budgets to really constrain any budget pressures they were seeing, because we could always say, are you sufficiently certain about this and sufficiently confident it's going to happen that you're happy for us to we'll be publicising in X weeks. And that did put a pressure for people to really resist cost increases wherever that was possible. So I think the transparency has been really helpful. It's quite a lot of work, but it's probably saved more in terms of the time and burden, and I think has really helped in terms of just educating about what has been a complex position. The last thing I'd mention, Jeremy's construction background, we've talked quite a lot about the build side, but there is a complete difference, and we had to shift quite a lot, and it's worth bearing this in mind, between construction and operations. It was a gradual shift over time from a financial point of view, but the project in total did go from a period where it was almost entirely, certainly from a funding point of view, about the build, to a period when it was all about operationally what was happening on the ground. We changed some of the decision-making forums, so we changed the members, we actually went to a group that was all the finance directors dealing with operational issues, which was during games time meeting daily. We had to change the funding during the spending review, so we had more flexibility about funding operational requirements, and we needed different expertise who could help us, not just construction, but more operationally and sport focused. So everything that's going to get built, by and large, goes into an operational phase afterwards, and if you sort of go into it thinking those are the same, and the same structures, the same funding, and the same operations will work, then there's a high risk of coming a cropper. So operations and construction being different is an important point. If I was picking out two out of all, I think the transparency has been a really big benefit to us, and I think has been unusual. I think the decision making and sitting along that side, the managing of contingency and how that decision got made there, I think have been really important trends that I would sort of recommend to other projects.
That's very interesting. And one of the things that people quite often say goes wrong in public sector projects is the desire of ministers, and particularly maybe changes of ministers, to rescope projects. Yep. And so how do you manage ministers to not sort of get in the way of your very slick processes here?
I think there was a commitment right from the beginning to be sort of bipartisan about the Olympics, and I think that's something that maybe isn't replicable in everything else, but has really helped us. There could have been that commitment without the substance to deliver it, but I think the the behaviour followed the commitment, and I think there was either side of the election, with this administration and the previous, a real commitment to keep the other parties informed and for them to understand the scale and the challenge and the issues. So I mean, I used to do, well, all the way through, whoever's been in opposition, we have done regular budget briefings and progress updates, just so there was an understanding of the scale and the challenge. And I think by the time, certainly with the change of ministers with the election, in terms of construction, it was too late. You know, really anything by then was, you know, and that was the message we gave. It's just, you've got to keep going. You know, change will cost money and put the whole thing at risk. And we've just, I mean, you know, Jeremy was very clear about it. And all our advice always was, keep going. You know, we're on track, but the one thing that will mess us up is change.
That sort of TV programme that was Yes Minister, well, we were No Minister.
Right.
So that was it, really.
Okay, that's probably why you haven't got a future career. No. Anyway, let's throw it open and sort of have questions, comments. I know some people here are really informed about this. Some people have been much more distant from it. So there are some roving mics. So got one down at the front here. Anyone before we just say who you are, and then a few more people want to pile in.
David Amond, I chaired the Critical Friends Group for the Home Secretary, looking at the security side of it. Well, first, congratulations. My question is really based on that comment. Congratulations, you built this fantastic ODA machine. Do you think, you know, and learning lessons, the handover point was at the right place? Would it have been more efficient to have had more of a turnkey, everything from signage to hockey pitches, so that having got this really efficient machine for contracting and delivering, and then leaving LOCOG more to the planning of the operation and working with you in the final stages to actually just populate it and make it work?
We changed the handover point quite late on. It was, the park was handed over in January, and it was originally going to be beginning of June. I can't remember exactly, but it moved about 6 months earlier, which reflects that there was that sort of debate. I think it was the right thing to move it earlier, and I don't think it would have been right to do it later, because I think LOCOG had to operate it, and the longer they had being familiar, getting it how they wanted to put on the event was worth the sort of earlier disruption that caused. There was a trade-off, but I think it was more important that they had access to and control of the park and the venues as early as possible, to get familiar, get on top of managing them and being able to make sure everything was working perfectly so that it could work in games time perfectly. Was right, actually.
Sort of by driving sort of issues from the right of a programme to the left of the programme, right, ultimately is of great benefit. And things like getting Broxbourne up and running early, and sort of say
what Broxbourne is.
Broxbourne was the whitewater rafting,
right? Rafting.
And say to Lee Valley, here it is, it's yours, and get on with running it. You know, ditto the velodrome. There was you had a chance to bring the permanent management in, and they were trained and they got used to operating it as their venue. And so by the time you got to the games, you got a completely self-sustained operating unit there. When I arrived here, a lot of people said, oh, this whole thing will collapse in a shambles after 2 years because the organisation structure is wrong. But the reality is that if you take the sort of top 200 odd people on the Olympic Games, no matter where you're sitting, most of us stuck it out all the way through. And so despite all the organisational difficulties that there were about crossover between you building it and you staging it and you using it, the fact that we all knew each other, right, issues just got resolved. And I think one of the unspoken successes of an Olympics is in fact that we made the organisation structure of the whole thing work. So I wouldn't, with the benefit of hindsight's a great management tool. Usually I have to employ foresight, but never mind. But hindsight, I wouldn't change it, no.
Okay, any more questions? We've got some, yes, at the back.
Hello, my name's Peter James from the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. I heard Jerry Walsh of LOCOG speak last week, and it prompted my question. Now, obviously, the Olympics is quite a unique event and required a great deal of talent and skills. Now, those people, those skills, can they be mainstreamed into routine government activity? And would they want to go in there?
Well, that's two questions. I mean, can they go in? Absolutely, of course they could go in. And that's sort of why I started, what I said with the way that government as a client needs to move quite a long way to get itself to become a place of excellence in project management and procurement. And it seems to me that, I don't know how leadership will make this happen, but it sort of needs to be the go-to place for everything. It's like, not, oh my God, I don't want to go and work for government, right, they never get things done on time, to how can I get a job in government? That's the place to be. And that would be a great goal to achieve. And a procurement person in an OCOG like Jerry, why couldn't he be successful in government? Well, perhaps it's the structure of government or the way it works, but then we have to change that. It's us, we're in the room, we should change how we work.
But some of it is specialism. I mean, Jerry is, use that example, not here, but he is a procurement specialist. That's what he does, and he has got that particular expertise. It's not a generalist, and I think we've tried to do. I was mentioning about the right people in the right role is get the best specialists in specialist roles, and I think that's one of the cultural questions the civil service would have to get over if it wants to go down that road, because you have to recruit and reward specialists for specialist skills.
But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the sort of talent didn't exist internally, given the figure you gave of the number of major projects and the sort of project spend. Yep. It's quite interesting. The immediate reaction is, oh, well, we're only doing 400 billion of capital spend in the public sector. Better go to the private sector, because that's where the talent is. So
bonkers.
It's quite an interesting point to reflect on why that isn't. Maybe MPLA is going to make a difference. More comments? Yeah, Simon.
Simon Judge, Department for Education. Jeremy, there's a lot of discussion about the role of the SRO in government, the senior responsible owner, and that covers a whole raft of projects, from building things to running policies to implementing change on the ground, which I think may impact on some of the points about specialism you're making. If you had 2 or 3 points to give to an SRO in a government project as to the things they should really focus on, or the personal skills they really need to build, what would you say?
Well, from the client's perspective, from government's perspective, it seems to me amazing how quickly departments change their SROs. Right, the sort of lack of consistency through the life of a project, I find absolutely amazing. So on the client side, you've got to put the right person in the right job at the right level and keep them there through the life of the project. To continually change your project or program manager is a disaster. And from the point of view of the individual, spend time, the SRO, understanding what it is that your client wants. Right? What is your client's business? What are they seeking to achieve in terms of delivery? How to make your client successful. I'm often used to repeat a phrase within the Olympic executive and in government. One of our jobs is to help LOCOG be successful. Because if LOCOG is successful, the games will be successful. There is no use ODA building the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? And us so hamstringing LOCOG that they can't operate, or we just give them the wrong platform on which to stage great games. So truly understanding the success features for your client is essential. Sticking with it is essential. Understanding source and application of funds is absolutely essential. And managing risk is essential. Risk at all levels. And if we all trotted down to Cabinet Office and asked them about risk on the Olympic Games, they would say, there's 162 strategic risks. And if you go into OCOG and ask OCOG what the risks were, probably had 4,000 of them, or something like that. I mean, Nikki would be able to tell you at the back there. And ditto ODA, ditto Peter Hendy and transport, etc., etc. But the SRO has to understand all of that and keep risk properly managed at the level at which it can be managed, not some theoretical level up here. the further you can close the gap between risk and the way it's managed, the better. So there you go. Risk, source and application of funds, how to make the client successful, you know, and time, I guess, and stick with it.
So, Jeremy, if we look at one of the risks that did materialise, because in the sort of run-up to the Olympics, there was the sort of little local difficulty with our friends in, I mean, David might want to comment on this more than you, with our friends at G4S and the little glitchette there, which led to whatever.
It's a
so
rotterism, I
in
think,
terms of in terms of this sort of picture of all these risks being located in exactly the right place and being extraordinarily well managed, how did we actually get into that? And maybe you'd like to reflect a bit on how we then got out of it as well.
How did we get into it? Well, for security, if you're in security in the UK, there's a thing called the Green Book, I think it's called, right? And so sort of the Green Book says, I'll make it very simple, if you stage an event, a sports event, you're responsible for security of that event. Right? Fine, we've got that. And that's the way the police and the security business of the UK operates. And in the Olympic Games, we've got an OCOG with a sort of a scope of work where they were responsible for venue security, right? But to some extent, not the other bits, right? And so what we had in security in its totality, right, was a divided scope of work between various parties, whether you're a Home Office or a policeman or an army guy or a LOCOG or no matter who you were, right? And LOCOG went out and they got the best company to do it, the most capable company in G4S, right? And they fell flat on their face. Right? They didn't have the right management systems, they didn't have the right management information, and unfortunately, you know, we to a degree were culpable because, you know, being an intelligent and informed client, we should have picked it up earlier, right? But we didn't, because we were getting information that sort of, you know, it's all right, it'll be all right on the night. And when that is going wrong with a contractor, right, I've been there many times on both sides of the fence, right, it takes a while for the client to pick it up, what truly is happening, if what's being reported is not actually what's being delivered. Fortunately, I mean, it's, you know, why do you have government as a guarantor for the games? Because government can stand in. We had a great bloke called Major General Parker, something like that. Once this guy turned, Major General Parker, once he turned up from the army, whoopee, you know. It was right, 5,000 from here and 5,000 from there, and you will do this. And the thing was put right. It was just extraordinary. You know, I was like, you know, I was a very happy project manager at that point. And in the end, it worked out very well. Right? And, you know, I think generally our client and our customers, the 10 million, saw the army. They were not intrusive, and it wasn't overwhelming. And so we got out of jail on that one. And unfortunately, G4S is sitting there with a big bill, right? 2 people have gone from G4S, the executive responsible, and the chief executive is going to have to explain to his shareholders what the final account settlement is going to be. So watch this space.
I think, Joe, it's also worth saying, I think in managing risk, there are risks you can sort of manage away as issues get resolved in the planning stage. And there are some things that are live in the operational phase, and what you need is a contingency plan in case that, you know, you can't get rid of the risk, but you can have a contingency plan against it. And what we had for this risk was a contingency plan, which was activated very quickly, because once the G4S position became clear, within 24 hours, the mobilisation of the military had happened, and as we all know, worked really well. So there was a contingency plan in place in case of that, as was happening, in case that the supply we were being assured was there, wasn't actually there.
And you know, between Theresa May, Jeremy Hunt, Secretary of State, and others, it was crash. They were together. Okay, what are we doing? Right, that's what we're doing. And it was really very quick the way the solution was put together, and that's what we did.
Very impressive. Let's provoke some more questions. Yeah, we'll go there. We'll take a couple. Go there and then back here.
This would be a question on sustainable development.
It's not actually a question. Hello, Jeremy. I'm Sean McCarthy.
But it was another success of the Games.
Another success for the Games. Yeah, I'm chair of the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012. But actually, no, my question is about clients. Jeremy, you make continuous reference to the client throughout your talk and your answers to the questions, which I think in itself is very healthy and something that government can learn from. How often does government refer to the client? But in the very early days of the ODA, there wasn't a client for legacy. There was a client for the games, but there was the ODA, and then there was the early days of the OPLC. And certainly my observation would be that some of the kind of early design decisions around the venues and some of the things that were done possibly could have been better had there been a client at the earliest stage. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, it would have been better earlier, right? But the reality was, I think we're the first games that's ever set up an entity like what was then the Olympic Park Legacy Company, right? And getting these characters in Treasury and CLG and GLA, was it? Tessa Jow and all the rest of them, get them over the finishing line to get that company set up was just terrible. Anyway, we got it done, but it could have been earlier and it could have been better. You know, I think there's such focus on it now, right? And with, you know, a lot of good work has been done on it now. There's a couple of difficult hurdles still to get over, the stadium and the media centre. Right? Would they have been better earlier? One of the things David didn't talk about, that I sort of gave him a prompt, was the financial crisis of 2008. And, you know, this is a long explanation, but what happened in 2008, particularly to the media centre of the village, and I mean, we had several OMG moments, never mind HMG. Watch HMG have an OMG moment, that was fun. Do you want to just talk about that media centre?
And I think it does connect into the
It
legacy.
connects into legacy.
So both the village and the media centre were intended to be privately funded, and were making good progress through sort of 2007 to be privately funded, until the sort of credit crunch effectively did for all the private funding, or did for it in any way that was defendably good value for money. So we had to, on both those, effectively, that's where the contingency came into play and decision making about keeping progress, but also protecting the legacy in both of those assets came in. And on both, in effect, we put in a publicly funded solution, put in arrangements to keep the work going, get them delivered, funded from the public budget, but then knew how they were going to go back into their legacy mode and into private ownership later. The village already has, so last year, autumn last year, we completed the sale of the village. Part of it was sold, the social housing part was sold in 2009 and the rest last year. So the village has now gone back into private ownership, and its legacy ownership and legacy use is completely secure. The legacy company is well down the road and has got a preferred tenant and operator in place for the media centre. So I think one of the challenges, I think it must be right that earlier would have been better. It goes to anything we can bring to the left is always better. I think the difficulty in the legacy is, you know, so we had the legacy company up and running effectively in 2010. You know, other than the two that are remaining, everything had secured legacy uses and tenants before the games. I think very much earlier, it's such a long time frame before anyone would have had access that it would be very, very difficult to get any commitment. You know, one of the problems that stopped, you know, a football solution being built into the stadium was it was just too many years ahead before anyone would commit. So nobody's going to commit in 2006 or 2007 to become a tenant in 2014. There's too much uncertainty. So I'm not sure we'd have achieved very much more if there'd been a greater client focus earlier, because just the time frame between when that consideration would have happened and when it actually became usable would have been so many years.
You can get input on usability of a venue,
But it's not commitment.
But it's not a commitment, you know.
We had a question here. David, do you have a question? Yep. Okay. And then Rona. So two together.
Thank you. David Prout from DCLG. Jeremy, you in particular sort of expressed quite a lot of frustration with the interface between government and the programme and the sort of the way you had to relate to government. I think you said you may not quite have meant it. You should, if they could just have given me the money, I'd have got on with it. Which maybe G4S would have said as well.
Yeah, there you go.
But the interesting thing for me is, so what would be your prescription for a good relationship between the government and the programme? You know, if you were setting up again tomorrow, what would have been the principal guiding, maybe 2 guiding principles that you'd have wanted to see?
Okay, well, hold that, and we'll just go
Okay.
to Rona. Right.
There's a budget bit of that.
So be thinking about that one.
My question is just around complexity. As a young and looking upwards to a civil servant, you both convey this sort of message of having this grip on both the breadth and the depth of what it took to deliver the games. And my question is how did you do it? What was the personal strategy that allowed you to do that time and again throughout the project?
Okay.
First question.
So the first question first. I think
The first question is the easier one.
The
but
first
anyway.
question is the easiest one. What I'd probably say is that, one of the things that's frustrated David and frustrated me for 5 years is sort of the position that government found itself in because of all the negotiations and the way that the project got set up. Right. So one of the great things for a client to do is to set a project up in such a way that it enables the people it brings in to execute it in a seamless, simple, cost-effective manner. And so things like having 7 accounting officers, wasn't really much fun. That we had, for instance, sort of said to the IOC, yeah, we'll pay whatever it takes to support the OCOG, right? And yet we had no, what I would call, direct lever of control with the OCOG. We were a sort of a third shareholder. We underwrote the whole thing. And we've had to give it a shed load of money. I mean, I can't tell you how much money, because it would appear on the front page of the New York Times. And so it's things like that, as a project manager, you get very frustrated with. Sort of indirect management is a much more difficult thing to do to assure success for a client on a time of the essence project where you've got hard dates than hard levers of control where you can make quick decisions and we don't have to go through long consultative processes that take just forever and often don't yield a better result.
Just at a simple financial level,
Sorry.
I think you could for major projects, conceptually there is no reason why a project shouldn't have a project budget that is treated differently from the normal budgeting cycle that looks at ongoing expenditure on an annual basis of revenue and capital. And I think we had much greater flexibility in the sort of pre-2010 environment than post, for reasons we sort of understand. But that complexity did nothing to aid the project and did add complexity. It didn't, I wouldn't say it's dramatically harmed it, but it made sort of decision-making just much harder. And this, we had, at the period when we did have, at least 7 accounting officers, decision-making, that was why we had this big collective forum I talked about, but it made getting actual decisions finalised much more complicated than it needed to be.
But the other argument could be that cross-departmental working is not necessarily the biggest strength in the world.
Yeah.
And if you had the budget, say you'd had the transport budget or something, then actually DFT would have said, they've got the transport budget. It's nothing to do with us, Gov. We'll go off and do some other things or whatever. So, would that have been a risk in your model?
But you've got to put the money where the delivery is.
Yes.
It's not about people who think they're delivering and actually they're delivering nothing. Right? It is with the people who are delivering. And it's a bit as we kept the contingency. We put it right down. So if you're the project manager on the stadium, guess what? You've got my contingency. Right?
I think I'm already scared there. Anyway.
And yeah, that is a bit scary to think about. So that indirectness of financial control, I think, is a big impediment. And it may be this is the way that government runs itself with the departments, but nevertheless, in the project world, it kind of doesn't work. It's not very good.
Okay, Rona's question.
Your question. Why don't you go first?
No, I think the answer is what Jeremy said. You can't. None of us can actually. I don't think any one person had a total understanding of the totality of the whole, because it is so vast. You know, if you include the sport and the construction, the ODA did all the operation, the scale of operation, LOCOG put on the sport activity or the legacy, and it's the point about the consortium of the willing. What we had to have was sort of empowered organisations with responsibility, and sort of GOE was the only bit that did cut across and had to try and sort of coordinate on behalf of government all of it, but we had to sort of focus ourselves, if you like, across the top level and deal with issues that came up that were important enough we needed to deal with them, or financial stuff we had to fund, or things where there was a lack of integration. And we looked for integration risks, we looked for gaps between organisations. We didn't dive into the minutiae of the detail of what each one was doing. So it's the scale point, it's too big for anybody to try and have their head understanding or their arms round all of it. You have to let the individual functions who have got the elements do those parts and take responsibility and sort of have the reporting so you know the issues, reporting so you know the progress, but otherwise let them get on with it.
And equally,
That's my
create a culture where people are not afraid to come along and say, I've got a big problem. This was going to cost £1 million and now it's 3. And, this thing I used to say to people, ask forgiveness, not permission, just get on with it. Right, there's Jonathan crept in the back there, so he'll remember that often enough. Or, was it, we're going to solve this whole problem, soup to nuts. That was another favourite saying. So, get the whole thing delivered. Sorry? Yeah. It's you've just got to move it along. So, helping people do that, create an environment where people can do the work that you're employing them for. Recognising in government that you're sort of a client, although we weren't really a client of the Olympics, and try and engage that sort of philosophy across the whole team. And we all know each other, so if we've got a problem with money, we pick up the phone and talk to Tony, or if it's sustainable development, pick up the phone and talk to Sean. It might not have been his responsibility necessarily, but with that whole team culture and one project culture, right, everybody just set to it and focused and got the work done.
We've got a final question over here, so...
David Allen from Biz. I'm really interested in this kind of concept of seek forgiveness, or
ask forgiveness,
ask
not
forgiveness,
permission.
not permission. It's a really kind of interesting kind of caricature of the kind of, except for kind of in central government, forgiveness never kind of comes around. And I think there's an example, obviously, in the press as we're speaking at the moment. I think and we've spoken a lot about decision making in a kind of central context, so relationships with Treasury, relationships between kind of big institutions. A lot of what you've talked about actually is, at its height, hundreds of thousands of people having to make decisions on a daily basis, and given the eye of the world, these decisions had to be right, had to be confident they were going to be right. And many of us in central government departments are actually responsible for quite, overseeing quite big delivery systems where, again, you're looking for confidence and decision making throughout that chain. And I wonder if you could say just a few words on how systemically you got confidence and assurance that actually the decisions that people were going to have to be presented with and would have to make they'd make the right decisions.
Why don't you go first?
Well, I think we've talked about the culture about empowering decision making at the at the lowest level possible. That certainly was the principle right through actually the Games operational period, but it was also the principle through the planning and development period. So the way we talked about sort of putting money responsibility as low as it could be to align with where risk was managed, gave people empowered responsibility to take decisions, and people I think took that and had to be sort of trusted and empowered. I think the important point was it was the point about time being of the essence. Therefore, we had to make decisions, and almost quite often any decision is better than no decision, and avoiding delay. And I think we always tried to keep the work going, avoid delay, and therefore people made decisions and were sort of empowered to. And there was no sort of culture of blame and come back when that happened. I think it's partly it was a group of different organisations all working together without any one of those being in control of the others. So we didn't have control over LOCOG, we had I mean, technically we probably do over ODA, but the relationship wasn't like that. It was a relationship of equals, and we were able, people worked together to make those decisions and escalated ones that, if they were uncomfortable or they needed authority, that they were escalated.
So you never had any oh my good moments when you thought, oh my God, they can't have decided that? Were you worried about that?
Yeah.
Because that's what we'd be nervous about in government.
He's looking astonished now.
Well, I don't think there were any we didn't know about. I think they were always discussed, yeah. I don't think,
we never discovered a rogue unit making lots of sort of commitments that you hadn't quite expected, or?
No.
Well, sometimes people wouldn't take no for an answer. Of course, they kept coming back, but anyway, never mind.
But the people knew what was happening.
I'd sort of answer your question a slightly different way, really. If you imagine the organisation as a sort of a traditional pyramid organisational structure, the kings for this project were sort of right across the middle. Right? And they were people like the venue managers. So that person running Broxbourne, the Whitewater Rafting Centre, which was the first one that we handed over, and I think the second one was the Velodrome, and I've just forgotten the name, so I'm sorry. But after a little while, that project was theirs, right? And if you were working sort of underneath them, you're working to them, they were your boss. But if you were, at a higher level within government or an OCOG organisation or an ODA or legacy company or wherever you were really just providing a service to them, to allow them to work properly. And that whole concept of government and sort of the big executive and others enabling those kings for the project, however many hundreds there were, to just do their job, on time. It was very clear what they had to deliver. They'd got their budgets, they got control of their destiny, their bits of the asset, their people, their own programs. They were given whatever service they needed. There's a guy in LOCOG, Jerry Pennell, who looked after IT. If you look at the way Jerry worked in delivering IT service, he just provided to those kings the IT platforms that they needed to run their bit of the business. And that was just replicated many times, whether it was safety or IT or a commercial function or a government function in delivering bits of legislation which were necessary to enable the ODA to do transport or the OCOG to do something they wanted to do. That was the name of the game. Just continuously dealing with business issues to allow the individuals to be successful in what they were trying to achieve.
Okay, it's 7:15.
Oh, we've overrun.
No, it's exactly 7:15, so you haven't overrun yet. We have a fixed deadline. No. Saw that Jonathan Stevens, who's Permanent Secretary at DCMS, just came out. I just wondered if Jonathan wanted to ask any question of these guys.
He's had 5 years.
He's had 5 years to do it.
This is your last opportunity ever to ask them a question publicly.
Jeremy, what do you need to ask forgiveness for?
And where are you to come back for the PAC inquiries?
By the time I've gone in 3 days' time, all my sins will be so deeply dug down, you'll never get them.
Anyway, Jeremy and David, that was terrific. I think it was really interesting. As I said, this is the first of the series that we're doing as part of the Games. On the 23rd of October, we're going to look at the Games from a completely different perspective. And we have some of the people on the vision marketing side. So we have the Games have many parents, but Tessa Jowl and Ken Livingston can claim to be sort of parents, or at least sort of midwives of the Games. And we have Jackie Brock-Doyle, who some of you will have seen on television during the Olympics, but who was Communications Director at LOCOG, is behind a lot of the terrific marketing around the Games. They're coming to talk about creating the vision. Then in November, we're going to look at the delivery. We have Paul Dayton coming, Jonathan's coming. We're trying to get someone from ODA to come and talk there as well. We hope we'll do that. And then we're hoping to end up in December. We're also, I think, going to have a look at the GOE. We've had two of the outsiders in GOE. We're also going to try, I think probably at lunchtime, to meet people who don't want to come to the events in the evening, have the view from some of the civil servants within the Government Olympic Executive as to how it looked from them working with all these strange private sector, or semi-private sector imports. But I think it was a really interesting, fascinating insight. A taster. Hopefully you all managed to get through all the acronyms, which we did, but it's a bit too late to explain to you what an OCOG is if you haven't followed it for the last hour and a half. But anyway, but anyway, thank you very much to Jeremy Beeton and David Goldstone for taking time out. You may now have to dash down to the Cabinet Office to share your drink with Sir Bob and Sir Jeremy, because the one thing that we failed to organise rightly on time is to not have our first Making the Games event clash with the celebration for the success of the Olympics event in the Cabinet Office. But anyway, thank you very much to Jeremy and David. But for those of you staying, there